What's up, smart homers? My name's Aaron, and in this video I want to show you how I healed my unhealthy ZIGBEE network, going from a network where devices were constantly dropping off to a rock solid one with snappy performance. As you guys probably know, I use Home Assistant as my smart home platform of choice, but the tips I'm going to give you in this video should also help you if you use SmartThings or Habitat. So here's where I was a month or so ago. As you guys probably know, I've tested a ton of different devices that work with Home Assistant. I've tested motion, contact, and temperature sensors, smart plugs and smart buttons, smart locks, and most recently, smart bulbs. I've put a lot of these devices into use in my smart home, but I ran into a problem specifically with my ZIGBEE devices in my ZIGBEE Mesh network. I started noticing that these devices were becoming unavailable and dropping off of my network, and thinking it was a battery issue, I began systematically replacing the batteries in all the devices that had become unavailable. Once the batteries were replaced, they easily connected again, but within a few days, the devices had gone dark. As a quick recap on ZIGBEE devices work in a mesh network. The network has a coordinator, routers, and end devices. The end devices are things like sensors, plugs, bulbs, etc., and often these end devices also function as routers. The coordinator determines the quickest path of communication for the devices to communicate with each other, either directly with the coordinator or else through one or more routers, and then to the coordinator. Routers, as the name implies, help route messages between the end devices and the coordinator. My network was composed of a single coordinator, a Nortek HUSB ZB1 USB dongle, two routers, a third reality smart plug, and a Jazzco smart outlet, and many end devices, most of which were Aqara devices. For the software side of things, I used ZIGBEE Home Automation, or ZHA, which is a built-in ZIGBEE integration in Home Assistant. So let's talk about how we fix it. The first thing you need to do is get an idea of the state of your mesh. I'm a visual learner, and Home Assistant has an awesome tool to deal with this if you're using ZHA. In Home Assistant, go to Devices and Services, click the ZHA integration, and click Configure. At the top of the page, click Visualization, and you're going to see a visual map of all your devices. This network map is really just meant for troubleshooting and visualization, and any changes you make to this aren't going to actually affect your ZIGBEE mesh. The visual shows you each of your ZIGBEE end devices as circles. Each ZIGBEE router device is shown as an oval, and your ZIGBEE coordinator is represented as a rectangle. If you zoom in, you can see the given name, actual name, and type for each device, as well as some network information. There are lines connecting the devices together, showing how the mesh network is laid out. The lines each have a number and a corresponding color, indicating how good the connection is. The number goes from 0 to 255, with 255 being the best connectivity possible. If the line is green, connectivity is good, yellow is mediocre, red is poor, and gray is very poor. What I noticed actually confirmed some suspicions I had, which I'll talk about later, and that is that a lot of my end devices were not connected to the Jazzco or the third reality routers. For the most part, if the end devices in my network weren't connected to the coordinator, then they were unavailable. Before we address these issues and start to fix the problem, there's something else I want to mention. I've had quite a few comments on previous videos, especially my comparison videos, from people saying how much they hate their Aqara devices, like the motion sensors and the contact sensors, and how they drop off their network and they're very unreliable. Because of all these comments, I decided to look into it a little bit. I started researching Aqara devices, and from what I've read, and I could be wrong, Aqara devices don't strictly follow the ZIGBEE 3.0 standard. And that means that not all of the ZIGBEE 3.0 routers that are out there are going to work with those end devices. People in different forums were collecting evidence to show which of the routers that exist out there now actually work with Aqara devices. And so if you have those routers, it's more likely that your Aqara end devices will stay connected. Since I have so many Aqara devices, I decided that I was going to make sure I used compatible routers with those devices when I fix my network. One more thing we should do before we really start tackling the problem is to declutter. I looked for any devices that I had on my network that were not necessary or that I didn't use anymore. Maybe I bought them to try them out for a video, but I never ended up really using them that much. Or maybe I bought another device to replace that one, but I never removed that one from the network. The only devices I didn't remove were any of my existing routers, which I only had 2 as I mentioned. Once decluttering is done, it's a really good idea to strengthen your mesh with some router devices. So I began adding new router devices to my network, starting with the IKEA Trad-Free Smart Plug. After installing the plug and getting it added to my ZIGBEE network, I then had to repair any unavailable devices in that room. I refreshed the network, and then a ton of the devices that were always dropping off were connected, and a lot of them were connected through that router. After the plug, I then added 2 inner ZIGBEE bulbs as backlights, which you can actually see behind me, the backlights behind my monitors. And these ones also work as routers with Aqara devices. I also found that Sonoff S40 Lite ZIGBEE smart plugs work as routers with Aqara devices as well. So I added a couple of those, one in my basement and one in my master bedroom. Last but not least, I added 1 Aqara smart plug in my garage, hoping that these routers would cover the whole area of my house. Looking at my mesh network again, I still saw a lot of red, and I saw connections that didn't make sense. Devices that were right near that Aqara plug instead connecting to my coordinator. And I knew that I had to fix this, and so I decided to try the brute force method. I went through every single ZIGBEE end device in my network, removed them from the network, and then reconnected them to a specific router based on location. To do this, you go to the router's device page in Home Assistant, click the overflow menu by the ZIGBEE info, and then click Add Devices via this device. It'll start searching for your device, and then you can pair it. It should then pair with the router you choose, and you can do this for each device of concern or every single device in your network, like I did. After doing this, you have to restart Home Assistant to really let the visualization map show you how the connections are working. But I noticed that not all the devices that I'd add to routers were still connected to those routers. Some of them went directly to the coordinator or in another direction. It must be that ZHA or the coordinator tells them which is the best way to go and they connect to that, even if you've told them to connect to a specific router. While this feels like I don't have as much control as I want, all the devices seem to stay connected, so that was great. So here's an example of what was going on. The Smart Things button that I have in my office, right behind me actually, I had connected to my Third Reality plug router. However, the visualization map was showing the Smart Things button connected to the inner bulb, which is behind my monitor. The inner bulb had a lot of green connections coming from it, so that was telling me that it's a really good router, I guess. After all of this, there was still a lot of red lines, and I had one more thing to try, probably the hardest of all the things. If none of the previous solutions have worked, you might want to look at the more difficult one, and that is migrating to a new router. I say more difficult because even though there's a migration function in Home Assistant, devices end up dropping off, and there could always be some glitch or problem during the migration. As I mentioned before, I use the Nortek dongle that has both ZIGBEE and Z-Wave radios built into one, and I decided that I'd move my ZIGBEE network away from the Nortek stick and onto the Home Assistant Sky Connect. I decided to do this for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the Nortek stick that I've been using doesn't support ZIGBEE to MQTT. Z2M is an add-on for Home Assistant that can replace ZHA, and it's what runs your ZIGBEE network. I still haven't switched to Z2M, but it is a plan to do in the future, so I wanted one that was compatible with it. The other reason is that the Sky Connect has a feature called Multipan that's still under development, I believe, but will allow that device to speak not only ZIGBEE, but also Thread. If you haven't seen the Sky Connect before, I showed it in a previous video, and I actually showed how to migrate to the Sky Connect, so check that out if you're interested. Once I performed this migration, I then had to reconnect a bunch of devices that for some reason didn't survive the migration. At this point, I had reconnected all my devices a couple times anyway, so it wasn't a huge deal. After this was all said and done though, I didn't have a single device that was unavailable, and none of the devices were dropping off the network. Looking at the visualization map, I do see a bit of red and some, it looks like poor communication, but all the devices seem very snappy, and I still haven't had any drop-offs. I decided to let this go for a week to see how it performed, and to my joy, none of my devices have dropped off since. As you can see, I kind of did the shotgun approach here where I tried a bunch of things, and really maybe only one of these things is needed. If I was going to say there's one that you should do, it's to go ahead and add some more routers to your mesh. My future plan with ZigBee is to move away from ZHA to ZigBee to MQTT, and the reason is that I'm buying a lot of devices that aren't supported yet in ZHA, but they are in ZigBee to MQTT. And while I love the interface for ZHA, I care more about compatibility than I do about user interface. I'm also thinking about switching to the Sonoff ZigBee Dongle 3.0 Plus, as I hear it's an excellent ZigBee coordinator. And if I do, I'll let you guys know how that goes. Anyway, I hope this video helps you with some of your frustrations with ZigBee devices. And if you try some of these things and they work well for you, let me know in the comments. Or if there's something that I should have tried but I didn't, let me know. I'm all ears. Anyway, thanks for watching. See ya.